Okay, well, I think we should start this final session. So welcome back, everybody. And this is our final panel discussion before we draw the event to a close. So I'm Professor Kim Wolff. I'm Director of King's Forensics. And I think it's been a fantastic day so far. So let's finish off on a high note. We've heard throughout the day from our speakers about possible next best steps, and this started right at the beginning of the day with a wonderful keynote from Julia Gillard setting out the international context and calling for quality evidence research and involvement of the local community. This was followed up very nicely by our own Jessica, providing some interesting facts and figures, and I hope you've had the opportunity to actually access her presentation. Now, I was really struck by Asmita's comments that SEA was openly being talked about in different communities, and her view that it was under action and this was as important as under reporting really struck me as being an important feature of our discussions today. Sarah Champion told us sexual exploitation has been normalized in many areas, and we need to understand why and address that issue. Moving through the morning, it was clear that there are several blockages. The culture in the aid industry as a whole seems to be problematic in the way it's considering and dealing with this issue. Proper consideration of allegations was raised, a lack of accountability by funders who may not be properly managing aid organizations effectively. Culturally, we heard the topic is very emotive, obviously, as we've understood, and it's a very sensitive topic and often too sensitive in some arenas to understand. So local communication, we think, we know is key throughout the day. We heard that reporting was difficult, investigative journalism, difficult because of legal issues, and even a lack of basic forensic skills required to collect the data has hampered some investigations. We've heard about genetic genealogy and its potential to be used as a tool to help identify SEA as part of a repertoire of different approaches. And I think we saw altogether the very real examples from Margaret and her experiences in the Philippines. I think linked throughout the day has been a common thread about the individual voices of victims. And we heard about this first from Julia, but also through Margaret, and then finally from Jane Connors and many others of you, the importance of understanding the local community and doing no harm. And the social and ethical considerations should always be part and parcel of any approach that's undertaken. And I think we very much agree with that. The need, we've heard also, of legal know-how, the expertise to support activities. It's a difficult, complex area. A probable review around immunity and other legal frameworks is needed. And Andrew has called for the need for an international body. It sounds very much like we need that. Education, training and upskilling have also been mentioned by many of you this afternoon. And yes, 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 we need that. This should be integrated, of course, into any response. And the need for financial resources has also been key. And it obviously isn't a budget consideration when large organizations or small communities are talking about this issue. The drivers of SEA are still not well known, certainly in this area. So a joined up approach and zero tolerance of under action has been muted, which I fully agree with. So this panel is really to try and look at the next best steps. So we're seeking feedback from you all. We need further research on the nature scale and the under action. We're looking in our own little pilot study about DNA analysis. We want to understand the ethical and legal issues beyond which we've already garnered. and we need to understand how best to engage with local communities. And scaling up is the final issue, the big issue of how we operate across multiple jurisdictions, but provide a process that everybody can sign up to. So our panel welcomes feedback and questions and comments from you all, but I'm going to introduce and ask Duff to kick us off. Duff is a founder of Survivors Truth and will give us an insight based on her experience in Liberia and a little bit on how to scale up. And if we can find Chippo, I hope she'll join in as well. So over to you, Duff.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate being here. And I'm a little bit self-conscious being the one speaking here because I'm working directly with people on the ground in Liberia and have been since 2005. And so the technical, particularly internet connections are really challenging there. And so I have Cooper Vuku, who's on the ground there, and Asatu Ba Kenneth, who was the founder of the Liberian National Police's Women and Children Protection Section, both of whom I've spoken with and would love to be here and can't. So I'm very aware that I'm not representative of the people that I'm trying to represent. And after conversations with Andrew and Kim and some others, we've carried out some very informal and initial sort of focus group and conversations with people on the ground in Liberia about how people would see an initiative to, particularly to trace fathers through DNA. This was the question, the idea that we were presenting. And the initial kind of feedback that we got was very much in line with what the speakers have been talking about today, and very specific to the Liberian context. So I'll start with Asatu's feedback because she's from the law enforcement side, and this has been her work over many years. And also Cooper was able to meet with the current police commissioner for women and children's protection. And they were interested in this idea. These are two women who have worked for accountability and to end impunity of around violence against women and children of all kinds in Liberia. And one of the challenges that they have had is that those internal investigations, the structure of internal investigation within the UN and within NGOs has been very opaque. Even as the heads of women and children protection, they have not had access to data or information about what's happened. So I think structurally, that's, when you talk about how to structure an international body, really addressing that insular nature of those investigations. Both spoke to broad unofficial knowledge of exploitation and abuse of Liberian women and children by UN and international NGO staff, but not having actual data, not actually having actionable information to work on, even though investigations have been carried out. And Asatu spoke to the need, and exactly what you're talking about, Kim, in terms of having a real assessment in a nuanced way of the extent of the problem across the country and its impact on people today. I think this is one of the things, is that, Liberia had a large international and UN presence for many years. And so a lot of the cases that you would be talking about would be historical cases. And so assessing both the extent of the problem, what people know about the perpetrators, and also an assessment of people's interest and willingness to come forward in order to to then structure and shape programs that make sense and will actually be impactful and effective. One of the other things that we discussed that came out really during the Ebola crisis is how important in this particular cultural context to have the front-facing program be locally driven, be very localized. So having the perception and experience of people be that this is a locally driven initiative. During the Ebola crisis, I was on the ground in Liberia for some time, and there was some really interesting research on the impact of health education programs. And in the midst of the crisis, a lot of international actors had just gone ahead and done health education, had gone out in communities and told people what they needed to do to control Ebola. And the government was perceived as being very weak and ineffective. But in fact, in terms of adoption of practices, of effective health practices, the government actors were much more effective in actually getting people to do it. Even though from the outside, they appeared to be much more under-resourced, much less organized, etc. Like our assessment might be that, but they were actually much more effective. So that would be something specific to the local context. And then in terms of cultural components and perceptions of people, Cooper was able to talk with a number of people in very informal focus group settings. And it was interesting because my comment about that in the broader session, Dr. Awino was reflecting that, the concern about stigma would be coming from the men. It was the opposite. In Liberia, women were concerned about stigma for the women. They were also concerned about the status of the children once the expatriate parentage would be revealed. Because within Liberian culture, it's quite normal. And there was this wonderful story a woman told about her father's many wives and how sometimes one of the wives would have a child that everybody knew was from some other guy, but he was the father. And everybody just, that was the deal. And so in communities where the children, the comment was the children that have been left behind by UN or AIDS staff have been fathered by their mother's current husband, and it would disrupt their not just their relationship, but their status in the community to be exposed as having a different father. And there would be some variation. I think this is one of the things that's really important to just be mindful of when going into different settings, is even within a very small country like Liberia, you have, I think it's 14 different language groups. And there's subtle differences in terms of, we tend to think of, when people talk about Africa, they talk about the African context. And there are similarities, but there are also these subtle differences. So I wouldn't look at these as barriers as much as important things to consider and to really be in deep consultation about how to engage in ways that are respectful and constructive and actually going to have the effect of being helpful for people. But yes, it was very interesting that the women, at least in these focus groups, were more concerned about stigma and disruption of relationships. The men tended to have more empathy for the perpetrators. They would be like, these poor guys, like, what were they supposed to do? And they were just hiring sex workers, and maybe they didn't know they had kids. And then they were the ones who were interested in financial compensation. Like, well, if I've been taking care of this kid, I want the guy to pay me back. That was kind of the general kind of feedback that we were getting. So those are some of the general kind of points that came out that to me just really point to the value of having very localized understanding of how to go about implementing.
Okay, thank you very much, Deb. I think, as we've heard and from your own descriptions, the local context is vitally important in doing any kind of work of the nature that we're suggesting, and the local context text isn't the same wherever you are. It's actually very different, and as you said, different within communities. So we do see that as something that we need to tread very carefully with and ensure that we gain support and intelligence and work with people locally to enable this small pilot project to take place. I'm going to bring in Mark Joblin now, who is a professor of genetics at the University of Leicester, who will talk to us a little bit about the DNA testing and how it might relate to the project. And again, I think how it works in the local context will be a very important consideration. Are you out there somewhere, Mark? Hopefully.
If he is, he's going to need to click on share video and audio. Here we go.
Here he is.
Yeah, I did that.
Hi, Mark.
Hopefully that works.
Yeah, we can all see you.
Good. Okay, no, that was a mistake. Okay, so yeah, my expertise is in genetics, rather like Denise, who spoke earlier. So I think there is the potential, as this pilot study has set out, to identify people, and I think that Kings are, in my view, going about it in the right way by taking a cautious approach and using, engaging right from the beginning with ethical review, because I think one of the problems with genetics is that it's never about an individual. It's always about a network of individuals who are related. So we've just heard about the local context and how important that is to understand the social consequences of these kinds of investigations. But I think there are social consequences for everyone involved in a genetic study, because you can't just test yourself, because by default you're testing your own relatives and testing relatives of relatives and so on. So I think the approach is a very good one. I can speak from our own experience working in Kenya doing genetic projects. I mean, we're not trying to do the same thing, but what we're trying to do is to find ways of gathering evidence of sexual assault in low resource environments generally. And in there, again, we have found the same issue has been important, which is to engage with communities and understand the meaning of, how people understand the genetic evidence, and also what they understand about the consequences for other people of them undergoing testing. So yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to publish the findings of these kinds of studies in a very clear way. I think one of the problems with some of the genetic studies is they're published in specialist genetic journals, which are not always penetrable to others. And this is, from the evidence of this conference today, the people with an interest in this come from an extremely wide range of backgrounds: social scientists, lawyers, humanitarian, people who work in humanitarian agencies. And the language that the genetic data are explained in needs to be clear for everyone. So I would advocate publishing almost twice in these kind of things. One for a genetic specialist community that can understand the basis of what's being done and the nature of the evidence and the validation of that, but then also for a broader constituency who can thereby be enabled to engage in the genetics thing as a kind of mediation into the genetics for other people. So this has happened a lot in the public, in the area of genetic genealogy, where non-experts have got involved and sort of mediated between an expert and non-expert community. But I think that's an important thing that should be considered in these studies, where it's so important to such a broad constituency. you kind of need to make sure you're explaining it properly. There's a kind of mega public engagement piece of work that needs to be done alongside the science, and I'm confident the science will be done well, but it needs that additional thing if it's going to be valuable and it's going to be comprehensible and it's going to be go out to the people who need to understand what it is and how it works. So that's what I would say.
That's a very good point, actually. We have heard today about the need for education and training across the board, whether it's perpetrators, local communities, or larger stakeholders. So I think that's a very valuable point. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you, and thanks for the conference. I found it very interesting today, very engaging, and so important.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on slightly and change the topic to look at some legal aspects now. And Angeli Romero is going to just bring in a discussion about the Convention of the Rights of the Children and how that can be used to support this work. So over to you, Angeli. Again, you might have to click the button on the top of your screen and then share your audio and video button in order to materialize on the screen. I'm not sure if Angeli's here. Do we have Angeli? Or if not, we've also got Jeanette Eno, who would like to talk to us about governance and women's rights specialists, and she's the founder of the Choices and Voices Foundation for Women and Girls in Sierra Leone. Jeanette? I can't see who's on the call and who isn't, unfortunately, to reach out. Okay, I think we're just trying to get input here from Angeli. We have Jane joining us, and Andrew, I don't know if you want to add to the discussion in the meanwhile.
I'm just taking a look down the people list to see if Angeli is still here, because I know Angeli's got an enormous amount to add. I should add that Angeli was involved in the Philippines part of the project as a Philippines former prosecutor and attorney, being a Philippine national and speaking fluent Tagalog. She had the experience of ensuring full prior informed consent of the participants in the local language, female to female, which was an incredibly important part of that first round. So hopefully Angeli will be able to join us shortly. And I think the one thing I would add is we've had a wide range of speakers with a diversity of views and opinions. And it shows the complexity of the issue that we're dealing with and the need for us to take multiple prongs. You know, we've said on a number of times, Kim, that this is a small project to show how DNA might be able to track fathers in certain circumstances. We have never said this is a silver bullet to solve the entire problem, and no one would ever say that. It is dealing with a component part. And there are a whole lot of really good people working in their component parts of trying to fix the solution. We've all got to embrace each other in all the work that we're doing to each contribute to the other's work and understand that we're all doing different parts to solve the same problem, which is, as a number of speakers have said today, an abuse of power. And really, that's what it all boils down to. And we need men, women of all race, all religions, all backgrounds coming together and to say, which bit can we do? And a lot of people get very emotive about the work that we're doing. And I can understand that, because this is an incredibly emotive subject, particularly as Mark was speaking about some of the kids that we've been helping in the Philippines. And Margaret mentioned young Maxine a couple of times, and I feel for her so strongly. She's 11 going 12. And whether we get her father to do the right thing or not will depend on whether she does or does not get an education. It's as simple as that, how meaningful some of this work can be. So I understand why people are very strongly emotive in the component part that they're doing. But we've all got to reach out to each other, and we've got to embrace each other in the work that we're all doing, and understand that we are all a component part of a solution to a very, very big problem.
Thank you, Andrew. Jane, did you want to come in here?
I just wanted to say how interesting, and I've been very impressed by the speakers and the things that have been said. But I certainly support Andrew. I mean, no one can deal with these issues on their own. We have seen this. We've been very interested to see how entities that you wouldn't have thought would pick up on these areas, like OECD, DAC, NATO. You know, NATO didn't have a policy on sexual exploitation and abuse until last January, and we're seeing that there's more, you know, the policies are moving, but keeping the victims in mind at all times. Sometimes we go down rabbit holes and get very excited by complex legal questions, and we use DNA, as you know, essentially to rule in or rule out people for whatever they've been involved in, and also with regard to paternity claims. But we have to be aware of the fact that not all jurisdictions accept DNA, and they have particular requirements as to where it's taken, and legal systems are not necessarily that advanced in some spots, even in spots where you might think that they are very advanced. And as Andrew pointed out, we're looking at many, many legal systems. And sometimes we have fathers who are not enthusiastic about parental responsibility, moving to places where they know attachment of parental responsibility might be more complicated. So over to everybody, and I'll just sit here. I'm very, very interested in all your discussion, and interested in hearing how your project goes forward.
Thank you, Jane. And just a question, we have talked about how we can possibly scale up this situation. So our project is a very small pilot project, and it's brought about a lot of questions, and we've recognized the difficulty of doing this properly from an ethical and a social and a local perspective. So how do we overcome those difficulties to scale up and provide a more joined up approach to the whole issue on a bigger scale?
Well, I think there's no magic wand. That's the issue. And Jessica and I have discussed this earlier with regard to, don't raise the expectations of the victim survivors. We have to be able to deliver what we promise, because they've already suffered, and if this technology works, well and good. But what I'm moving towards is seeking to get agreements. And in the context where I work, we tend to know who the fathers are, and we want to get agreements between the mother and the father for the realization of the rights of the child, which are not only support, they're multifaceted reasons why you need to know who your parent is. So we scale up. I don't know whether we make sure we seek to work together and keep lines of communication open, and don't conclude that I've got the answer, you've got the answer. We might have a little bit of an answer and put the answer together.
Thank you. Jess or Dove, do you want to come in here, or Mark?
Yes. Yeah, I'd love to come in. What I think is quite exciting about bringing the different strands together, as Jane said, is that you create a really nice network support to try to push some of this work forward. And one of the things that I'm excited about working on next post this review is looking at what the overarching ethical and legal framework is that these ties are, which can then help kings some of this work forward to really understand the different ethical and legal components that are relevant to the subject. So with Dove, we've been talking about, how do you go in and map a community, understand what the power hierarchies are, make sure that things are translated into the right language, but also culturally sensitive, and getting an understanding of these things that she's raised about how the women and the men both view this approach. We've also talked about her and some of our legal experts, like what the actual implication of finding a father who has a Western background is, and understanding what the framework around that is in each country. So I think that framework that you can put in place to start to think about how you scale up this work, but it does require the inputs of a lot of people, and it will be very context specific, and it might be then useful for the type of international organization that Andrew is proposing is introduced, because then at least there's a solid framework around which they can hang their work and start to be sensitive to the local context and the places that they want to work and support and help.
Okay. Dove, you have anything here? I'm just thinking in terms of scaling up. So we've talked about the possibility in all working together. How about the resources? Where are the funds going to come? It sounds like it needs to be something concrete or something recognized as an ongoing issue, but I don't know the area properly, so I don't know where that might come from. Do we have any ideas? Dove?
In terms of the funding, well, I think in general, we really, we're talking about taking on one aspect of international humanitarian relief culture, right? Around sexual exploitation and abuse being a cost of doing business. I think another area of international humanitarian relief culture that needs to be taken on is the way that funding is channeled. Over and over again, we've seen in crisis situations where massive amounts of funding are channeled to the larger entities who hire consultants who go in and decide what should be done. And then local organizations and groups are tasked with implementing this and given some funds, but to implement these outsider plans. And in a case like this, this project clearly needs to have the design and the implementation being driven from the ground up. And so looking at how we can access blocks of funding, but really flip the funding model on its head, where the requests for support are coming from the ground up. The design and the implementation is really much more localized. Because there are things that need to be funded that are often completely left out of the budgets. Sorry, I have a very upset cat. He's very
hear it
at the moment. We've got a lonely kitten. But I think that, to me, is something I'm very passionate about. I see it, working in Liberia, working in Sierra Leone. If you look at the work of how the international, how the special court in Sierra Leone was set up, and the work that's been really effective at achieving transitional justice and meaningful reconciliation on the ground, there's this disconnect. And the funding is disconnected in that way. So I think it's really important for us to, as we go into conversations with donors, really challenge some of the assumptions about how the funds should get distributed and who gets say over what the money gets spent on. Because as you say, lunches might be a very important expenditure, which would not make a lot of sense to someone maybe back at headquarters.
Okay, thank you very much. And how about the DNA testing, Mark? How do we scale up on that? And Denise, I don't know if you're out there and able to join us, but is that feasible?
Certainly feasible, but it is costly. And there are issues around chain of custody and so on. So there are providers out there, and we're having some discussions in the UK context, who can do it cheaply, but you need to choose your providers carefully, because if you're going to come to some important conclusions based on your evidence, then you need to make sure the people doing the work are people who are generally trusted, and there is no room for doubt about that. So that means that some of the cheaper providers are probably not the ones to go for in this kind of work. And if you're going to scale up with an expensive process where you can't go to the cheapest providers, then some careful thought needs to go into that, into the sustainability and how you do that. I mean, there are international bodies that are involved in DNA testing, for example, the International Commission for Missing Persons, which must have an enormous budget, but which I imagine is essentially a UN budget. But that has its infrastructure and also considerable credibility. So ultimately, if some kind of partnership could work with an organisation like that and have economies of scale, then that might be a long-term something to aspire to. But I guess Denise has thought about this more carefully than I have.
Well, Denise?
Well, not necessarily, but it is, as Mark says, it is expensive to do it this way. Inevitably, it's expensive, and it can't be the solution for everything. The solution, effectively, I think, is which would solve most of the problems, is for the industry, the aid industry, to require of their employees registration of their DNA. And that can be done in a secure way, in a way that doesn't impact on them, but it protects them from being falsely accused. It protects the employers, and it also acts as a disincentive, because ordinary standard DNA testing is cheap and reliable and easy, whereas what we're doing here is not easy at all, and is difficult, and may not be always as reliable as you think it's going to be, because unless you can actually test the person, you're relying on inference from these databases. So that's what I think would make a real difference. Just as it's the requirement of people who are working for forensic providers, for example, to provide their DNA sample to protect their industry from accusations of contamination and stuff, of evidence. It's something that if the aid industry was willing to do it and could be done on a secure basis, it would make a lot of difference, I think, as far as DNA goes anyway.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, I would make a related point that as things scale up, it gets cheaper per unit cost. That's around the world fairly consistent. Let me come out of the aid world for a second, because one of the things that the Philippines pilot project showed us is there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children that have been born to sex tourists in Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand over the last 20, 30, 40 years, outside of the context of aid. And what I would love to see is pressure put on the US, UK, Australian, Canadian governments to build a partnership with the Filipino government to scale up what we've done in Angeles City, Cebu City, and other places where we know the transactional sex industry has been in place for at least 3 generations. One of the children, and I won't mention the child's name for reasons that will become apparent immediately, is the granddaughter of a prostitute and the daughter of a prostitute. The prostitution that's built around Angeles City, Clark Air Force Base, and the old Subic Bay Navy Base is now 3 generations old, started in the Vietnam War. If we can get Western governments to accept the responsibility of children born to sex tourists of their nationality and scale it up in that relatively easier context, then the cost per unit will come down, allowing us to be able to more effectively apply the DNA technology into the aid industry in the more complex environments that you see in post-disaster and post-conflict settings. So whilst the issues of children born of sex tourists and children born of aid workers are on many levels different, on many levels they are the same. And maybe that is where we need to go first, to scale up the industry, to scale up the data and the research, and to scale up the solutions to the ethical dilemmas that comes up in each of the cases. Because the other thing we've found in the Philippines case is every single one of the circumstances has raised a different moral or ethical dilemma. And whilst it's very easy to say the children that we were representing are the innocent victims, so are a whole bunch of other people. We might find the father, but the father also often, or in fact, on each occasion, has another wife and another set of children, all of whom are also innocent victims. And when you're bringing an unknown child into a family dynamic, you're dropping a hand grenade into that family dynamic as well. And each of these are ethical dilemmas that we need to figure out how to get over. One of the things that Margaret spoke of in her presentation earlier today was the case of Justin. What we really didn't dig into is one of the ethical dilemmas that comes out of Justin's case, that, as Margaret said, he was over the age of 18 and now an adult, which meant he wasn't able to get a child support order to fund his education because he's passed through secondary school education age. Our decision not to progress the broader family because of some dynamics within that family would have raised a very different dynamic and ethical issue if Justin had have been 12, not 19, where finding the father would have made a difference to his individual education. So scaling up involves not just the science, not just the law, but the ethics. And maybe it is, and maybe Jane, you and I can have a discussion on this offline about how we can get those Western governments to really partner up with governments in Thailand, Cambodia and Philippines to understand, particularly in the case of the British government with the Different Immigration Act, that all of these children running around Thailand, Cambodia and Philippines that are born of British sex tourists are British nationals, as of right, as of birth. And maybe that can allow us to solve some of the broader ethical, legal and personal issues that can then be applied to the aid industry more broadly in difficult contexts like Congo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Haiti, etc.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just responding to a comment in the chat now, and Mirna has asked if there is an interest in strengthening forensics at the level of the local context where possible. And I think this is something that King's Forensics has already been doing in various different countries for different reasons. So I think this is something that we would be certainly interested to explore and think there is probably a need. Denise or Andrew, please.
Kim, yeah, if I can jump in on that one. One of the dynamics that you see in Angeles City, north of Manila, is an enormous number of corner DNA shops. And it's a manifestation of the particular problem of Angeles City that there are claims for parentage left, right and centre because of the nature of what's happening in that part of the world. It's unregulated, it's uncontrolled, it's largely unethical and largely driven by the profit motive. So there's a lot of room for discipline and ethics to be applied to that. But what it shows is there's an overwhelming demand on behalf of mothers and children to know the ethnic origin of the fathers. One of the things that bewilders me at some point is the critiques of the mothers when people say, they're just after money, which my response is, yeah, and fair enough. If some guy has impregnated her, then she has every right to ask the father for child support. The child has every right to ask the father for education support. And should they be asking for money? Yeah, they should. And in one of the cases that Margaret referred to in the Philippines, the father said, well, I gave some money. And my response to him when I confronted him was, you gave a lot more than the normal father would in the Philippines, but a lot less than a court in the UK would have ordered you to do. And there is a lot of room to professionalise what has become mum and pop backyard industry in places like Angeles. And if we can professionalise that, then we can apply it over to the aid industry more broadly. So the more I've been thinking about this the last few months, the two things that at first seemed disengaged, the dynamics around the sex tourist industry and the dynamics around the aid industry. The sex tourism industry has a fewer hurdles to get over than the aid industry does. And maybe we need to perfect some of the aspects of it in the sex tourist industry before we can really scale it up in the aid industry. I don't know. These are some of the questions we really need to talk through some more.
Well, and the World Bank actually sponsors a program for strengthening forensics in countries where forensic science isn't as well developed. So I think there are other avenues that we could look at. I don't know if you want to add anything here. There's a question from, or a comment from Dove through DNA. Though DNA collection can be perceived as invasive, there is a precedent for professionals providing identifying data in many places. For example, anyone working with children in the US must submit their fingerprints for local and national background checks. So as you've said, Dove, it isn't as if we're doing something that's fundamentally different from what goes on elsewhere.
And Kim, if I can add to that, the word invasive is an interesting one because we're not doing vaginal swabs or taking blood out of people's veins. In this case, it's spitting in a tube, and in some cases, just doing a swab inside the mouth. Now, those of us in the last 12 months or so that have had a long stick shoved up our nose to find out whether we do or do not have a particular sort of virus have recognised that actually some swabs are not that invasive. Uncomfortable, yes, but not that invasive.
Okay. Any other points that people would like to make? We're coming towards the end of our afternoon's presentations. Jane, are you waving at me?
Because this was a proposal put forward by Prince Zayed with regard to uniformed personnel in 2005. It would be interesting for researchers who are there and available to look at the debate surrounding that and see which particular countries were not that enthusiastic. It's always interesting when you go into, I mean, I think it's interesting when you go back and you see what you don't expect, or if you've been in the system for a while, what I expect. But I think there's a bit of traction with some states, it has to be said, so in terms of their own personnel. So clearly if they consent, there's not an issue. It's very interesting, and I'm sure there are many civil libertarians who will be able to discuss things at length.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, consent's a funny one. Let me break it into two parts. I've been both a civilian aid worker and I've been a soldier. From the military side, you just get told consent, forget it. And if you don't like it, bad luck. On the civilian aid side, I am a big believer on, well, yes, you can consent, but if you don't consent, you don't go. And we've said a couple of times during today that a DNA sample has a couple of purposes. One is body identification after a firefight, or if the worst happens, and it does. I mean, Jane, you and I probably have friends that died together in the earthquake in Haiti, plus other circumstances. It's a defence against a false claim. Let's not be naive. The false claims are made. Not many. The FBI claim false claims are somewhere between 2 and 8%, and a legitimate claim for paternity. And I think we've been able to establish that the problem is widespread enough that there can be conditionality. It's a bit like the right to freedom of expression. You have the right to freedom of expression, but you don't have the right to freedom of expression without consequence. And you might be able to have informed consent, but if you withdraw your consent, you don't have the withdrawal of consent without consequence as well. But Jane's right. Civil libertarians will have a great time discussing this, and should have a great time discussing this.
So is the answer then an independent international group or organization to take this forward? Is that the answer?
Strangely enough, I would say yes. Look, a couple of people have said on the chat screens during my presentation, could this be part of the International Criminal Court? And potentially it could. Well, the one thing we don't have yet is an international civil court, because as I pointed out, a lot of these issues become a civil claim. And there are many circumstances in which a child is procreated in which there is no criminal aspect that attaches to it, but a civil aspect does. And there are many forms of sexual exploitation and abuse that don't involve the procreation of a child. And we've got to remember, going back to what we were saying earlier, that even this work is a small component of a large problem, because we are talking about women and children between the age of puberty and menopause, where the father is likely to be a European. So we're talking about a very small subset of victims that are out there. And there's a great deal of complexity. So, yeah, I do think there is now a warranted need for a designated international organisation, if for no other reason, with the best will in mind of many senior people over the last 30 years. The status quo hasn't delivered results for the victims that need to be delivered. And as Einstein said, or is often misquoted as saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. No, we need to fine-tune, we need to move forward, and we need a game-changing administration of what we're developing at King's with the help of particularly Lester and people like Mark, a game-changing technology. Okay, well, on that very good note, Andrew, thank you very much. I'm going to draw the conference to an end and thank everybody who's taken part, from our very early speakers this morning through to the panel and the discussions this afternoon. And I really do hope everybody has enjoyed and found the speakers and the conference and the discussions very helpful. I've certainly found them very informative. I think we are at the start of a journey. I know it's been a long journey, Andrew, but I think we've moved to a couple of steps up, and it's been a small but significant step today in terms of pulling people together and looking at the data and discussing how we can take things forward. I think this put us on a much firmer footing and will give us a platform by which to look for funding and greater recognition of the joined up approaches that are needed to manage SEA going forward. So again, thank you to everybody. Your participation has certainly helped us in the journey, helped us with understanding. And I think collectively, we are now a bigger group of people moving in the same direction. So thank you for your input. Just to let you know, the event page will be staying open for a little while longer. So if you want to network or reach out, please do. And if we haven't answered any of your questions, then we will try and do so over the next couple of days. And of course, when we have finished
our small pilot project, we will publish it and make sure that you are all involved in that process. So thank you so much again for your time. And thank you to those people that have joined, that have come to us at a very strange hour of the day or night. Thank you, Andrew. I have no idea what time it is at the moment, but I suspect it's well past your bedtime.
2:27 a.m.
Yeah, so well done. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'll say goodbye. So thank you.
Thank you.